Okay, let's wrap up this week 6 of Modern Philosophy 2 by looking at the very end of the reading for this week, the very last page. So I'm on page 546, right here at the top, and I want to talk you through most of this passage, and then I want to say something about the Copernican revolution in philosophy and where Kant thinks that stands. Okay. So let's look at the first sentence. It should be noted that here we have not been trying to establish the reality of freedom as a faculty that contains the causes of appearance in our world of sense. Okay, so again, what Kant's trying to do in this resolution of the third antinomy is actually quite limited. He doesn't want to establish that freedom is real. Now, Kant will say later on in the critique of practical reason, which is known as his second critique, that freedom has reality from a practical perspective. Where does it come from? Well, we have a consciousness of the moral law that makes the idea of freedom real for us. Well, what's the intuition that's based on? And Kant will say it's based on the feeling of respect that when we think about the moral law, we have a feeling of being both humbled by it, that, gee, what I'm being asked to do there is something that regards me as the kind of being that I'm not sure that I am, right? I cannot be certain that I'm free at the intelligible level. I can be pretty certain that I'm not free at the empirical level, right? But the moral law calls upon me to make a kind of leap of faith, to think of myself as a being that exists as a thing in itself beyond the limits of experience. Now, in some sense, I have to, because there has to be something in itself that lies behind any thing as it appears to us, and I do appear to myself in my experience. Not necessarily as having a soul or a personal identity across time, but I do appear that way to myself. However, there's nothing in my experience that tells me that I have to think of myself as free. So the moral law is calling on me to resist all of the impulses of self-interest and to act on the basis of the moral law instead, to act on the basis of a principle that's universal and necessary. And I don't know if I can, right? So the moral law calls upon me to think my way beyond the limits of experience, to make the leap of faith, of regarding myself as a thing in itself, as a being who is free. That respect, that feeling of respect that comes from comparing the empirical character of my being to the moral law is what Kant thinks of as the intuitive manifold that the idea of freedom is able to unify from a practical perspective, right? So we get a kind of object, practically, of the idea of freedom that we don't get theoretically, right? We don't know it, but we do always already presuppose it, right? So we get a kind of shape, not a shape of what we are as things in themselves, that we're free, but the shape of what it is we're positing or projecting into the intelligible realm on the basis of moral obligation. Okay, so then the next second sentence at the top of 546. For apart from the fact that this would not have been any sort of transcendental investigation having to do with merely with concepts. So I want to point out, this is something that I said earlier, that things in themselves are not accessible through the transcendental method. The true self, the self that stands behind the TUA, the transcendental unity of apperception, that is not accessible to us through experience. It's not accessible to us through transcendental reflection. right? So a substantial self or soul that remains the same across time, that is the being that lies behind the activity of the TUA, that's inaccessible to us. We have two ways of knowing. Way number one, experience. Way number two, the transcendental way, reflection on the conditions of the possibility of experience. But we can't get beyond the limits of experience by analyzing the conditions of the possibility of experience, right? So we can't get knowledge of transcendental freedom, right? We can't know that it's real from the perspective of knowledge. Okay, so after the comma, it could not have succeeded, right? So if Kant had tried to prove the reality of freedom from a theoretical perspective, he could not have succeeded. Okay, skip the rest of that sentence. Further, we have not even tried to prove the possibility of freedom, for this would not have succeeded either, because from mere concepts a priori, we cannot cognize anything about the possibility of any real ground or any causality. Freedom is treated here only as a transcendental idea through which reason thinks of the series of conditions in appearance as starting absolutely, right, outside of appearance in the realm of things in themselves. Last sentence of today's reading. To show that this antinomy rests on a mere illusion, and that nature at least does not conflict with causality through freedom. That was the one single thing we could accomplish, and it alone was our sole concern. In other words, Kant wants to declare the success of the resolution of the third antinomy, because all he was trying to prove was that freedom and nature do not contradict one another, and that was the presupposition of the argument. Right? So if we think all the way back to the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, we have reason in this state, right? So he says it's the peculiar fate of human reason, that we have certain questions that we can neither let go of nor answer, right? So we're stuck individually, and we're stuck at this point in the history of philosophy. No one can adjudicate between empiricism and rationalism, so philosophy is stuck, right? Knowledge is stuck. Ethics and religion are stuck at that point. How is it that we get unstuck, right? The way that we get unstuck is that we posit that there's a difference between things as they exist in themselves and things as they appear to us. And this is precisely the distinction that both the empiricists and the rationalists didn't make. That was their common mistake, right? To distinguish those two perspectives, the perspective of things as they are in themselves and the perspective of things as they appear to us. So what this means, if Kant is correct that he has resolved the third antinomy by appealing to the Copernican revolution, then that experiment that he talked about in the beginning of the first critique has in fact succeeded, right? Because he's managed to get reason unstuck by taking these two perspectives, right? So he thinks that the resolution of the antinomies, and here we're using the third antinomy because it's the most important of the four antinomies. We can see in the case of the third antinomy that reason can get unstuck by making this distinction. Therefore, we've proven the validity of this distinction. We've also discovered in the course of this resolution of the third antinomy that we've discovered what it is that Kant means by saying, I had to both preserve and cancel. Remember, aufheben, that strangely ambiguous German word. it says in the translation, I had to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith. I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith, but more literally, I had to both cancel and preserve knowledge in order to make room for faith. So what does that mean at the end of the resolution of the third antinomy? What it means is that the certainty, what Kant calls the apodictic certainty of scientific knowledge, is completely intact with regard to the world as we experience it. But we have to limit the purview of the natural scientific worldview. We have to limit its zone of legitimacy to things as they appear to us, to human experience, right? So we know things by means of this principle of cause and effect, but we also know that this principle of cause and effect is limited in its legitimacy to the world of appearance, to things as they appear to us, to our own experience, and it doesn't apply beyond that, which means that faith, which is Kant's overall term for what's happening in religion and morality, faith then has room to operate in the realm of things as they are in themselves, and nothing in the modern scientific worldview can contradict that, right? They're talking about two different perspectives. They're both related to experience, but they're talking about two different perspectives on experience. One, the modern scientific worldview looks at experience, looks at events in the world through their empirical character, whereas the perspective of morality and religion is the perspective of the intelligible character of those very same events. It is open to us to describe events in the world because of this distinction between appearances and things in themselves. It's open to us to describe things in the world, both, or any given thing in the world, any given event in the world, both as naturally caused, as standing under modern scientific explanation and its principles, and it's open to us to describe the same event as being caused either by a free human will or by God. And next week, in our 7th week, we're going to talk about the proofs for the existence of God, why Kant doesn't think that we can prove that God exists. We have to take an agnostic perspective on God, an agnostic position on God. But we're also going to talk in that week about why Kant thinks we should posit the existence of God, and even in some sense must posit the existence of God from the perspective of morality. Okay, you guys have a good weekend, and I'll see you back on Monday.